There are four very broad, common research methods that people use in studying people. Ethnography is just a fancy way of saying a scientific observation of people, that same kind of observation we've been doing in a natural setting, people just doing their thing, but done in a scientific way. Secondary analysis, using existing data, using other people's data, the kind of thing you've done when you've written research papers for school before. Surveys, just ask people about their lives and experiences and expectations and opinions. Experiments, creating an artificial scenario to test cause and effect. You're familiar with natural science experiments probably, and there are four common problems that we often run into in studying society. So confirmation bias, paying more attention to that which confirms your view. Selection bias is using sources of information that tend to be biased in one direction or another. Overgeneralization, the problem of studying one thing and thinking that it applies to everything else. We'll talk more about that. And the Hawthorne effect, the effect that researchers have on the people they're studying. So it's named after a factory, Hawthorne something factory. They were trying out new ways of motivating their employees, and they found out that no matter what they did, the researchers were finding the employees were performing better, and they realized it was just because the employees knew they were being watched and wanted to look good. So ethnography, it's just observing people in a natural setting, and hopefully in a natural setting you'll get natural behavior. Ethnography just means writing about culture, essentially. Now, of course, as we said before, when you're observing people, you have to be careful that you're doing it scientifically. Confirmation bias is noticing and paying attention to and placing more importance on evidence that supports your own prejudiced conclusion. So let's say you believed that girls were bad at math. Maybe every time you saw a boy get up and do a math problem wrong in your math class, you thought, wow, he's really dumb. That guy is really bad at math. But every time a girl got up, even if you'd seen other girls do well at math, you would say, that girl who got the math problem wrong just goes to prove that girls are bad at math. So how do you be objective then? Well, you use the scientific method. You acknowledge your biases, you pay attention to every situation and every piece of evidence that relates to your research, and taking careful notes regardless of whether the evidence and what you see supports or rejects your hypothesis, your opinion. So if you wanted to study men and women driving, you might go and stand on a street corner. Now, of course, you have to have an operational definition of what it means to drive badly. So you would say, okay, driving badly is running stop signs, running red lights, not using your turn signal, being on your cell phone. So every time you see someone doing any of those behaviors, you mark down whether it was a man or a woman, and you can just keep track that way. Now, that's a very shallow kind of observation. Ethnography often means a deeper kind of observation. Participant observation means embedding into the society that you're studying. So you go and you live or work or participate in the activities that your research subjects do in their everyday lives. They get to know you a little bit, they get more comfortable around you, they let you see who they really are. And it often can lead to questions you might have never even thought about, because you're seeing reality. You're seeing the raw truth of these people's lives. On the other hand, it takes us time to get people's trust. You generally have to be with this population for a while to really get a sense of what's going on, to get that Verstehen, that insider view, that understanding. So you end up with a sample size that is very small, and you end up with research that's difficult to verify. Now, what do I mean by sample size? Well, if you want to know what a cake tastes like, you don't have to eat the entire cake. You just take a sample of the cake. But if I was to tell you only what the frosting of this cake tasted like, it would be a very different opinion. It would be a very different idea than if I took a bite of the bready part of the cake itself. So if you want to get a representative sample, if you want to know what the cake as a whole tastes like, without eating the whole thing, you take a slice that has a bit of each layer. You try and get a sample of the population you are studying, so if you're studying college students in the United States, you don't just want to study Delgado students in New Orleans. You want to get people from a bunch of different colleges, different types of colleges, community colleges, four-year universities, different states. The more random and diverse your selection, the more representative it will be. And generally, the bigger sample size, the more reliable the results. So, if you want to get a really big sample size, but you don't want to spend a lot of money or take a lot of time, do secondary analysis. Take data that's already been researched, already been gathered. So what you can do with this is things like comparative research, looking at different researchers' projects and how they compare. Look at data from different countries. Look at how it compares. You can do historical research, comparing, say, life in the United States today to life in the United States in 1900. So it gives you this really broad range of information. If you wanted to look at men and women driving, you could look at the information from the Department of Transportation. It's readily available. And we find that among young drivers, it is in fact men who have the majority of serious accidents. Now you have to be very careful with all of this. You get a nice large view of society. It's fast and cheap. You can look at lots of different methods, but you are limited to the biases of the researchers. You are limited to the methods that they used. And there's a danger of selection bias. You need to be careful of where you're getting your information. If they're biased, then you will be biased. And this can happen through confirmation bias. Maybe you are a little more liberal and you prefer to watch a liberally biased channel like MSNBC. Maybe you're a little conservative and you prefer to watch a little more conservatively biased show like Fox News, and doing so is going to continue to feed that bias. That selection bias is going to continue to feed you information that supports a liberal or conservative point of view. But it can be accidental too. You might just happen to watch a particular news show, not realizing that it's biased. Or maybe you do a web search for women bad driving, which is going to give a lot of different results than typing in men bad driving. Yeah, try it yourself. Now, this is a major problem, selection bias, for people's understanding of just events in the world around them, the news, global happenings, because any news source you choose is going to be affected by the bias of its writers and editors. So I highly recommend, in order to get past this, reading a variety of news sources or watching a variety of news sources with maybe a little bit more of a liberal bias, a little bit of a conservative bias. Try and watch things from outside the United States, get other countries, other cultures' perspectives. Now, if you want to get your own data, you want a bunch of it, try doing a survey. Ask people directly about their lives and opinions. Questionnaires are the most common. You've almost certainly filled them out before. Usually it's just a list of questions, and there will be either short answers that you can fill in, or even just a list of options like, do you agree with this statement? Do you not agree with this statement? So again, if you're interested in men and women driving, you could ask, what distracts people while driving? What distracts you while driving? And you get from that, you can get a large number, a large sample of people responding, giving you good quantitative data. Quantitative data just means things like percents, ratios, numbers. So we can see from that men answering this survey said that they were distracted by eating about twice as much as women. Women were distracted by kids nearly 3 times as much as men. And so that's handy information, but a questionnaire like that has closed questions. So we may not be getting all the details. Why is it that women are more distracted by kids in the car? And questions may be misunderstood, or they may bias the answers in the way that they're written. So, texting and driving, is this how many people text and drive, or is this how many people think that they're distracted by their texting while they drive? If you want to get more in-depth information with a survey, you do interviews. You go face-to-face or over the phone or on a computer, and you just ask people questions, and it lets you dig a little deeper. Okay, so why do you find that you're distracted? Are you often on your phone? Do you often have kids in the car? Is it always that you're distracted by these things, or only under certain conditions, etc.? You can get a little more qualitative data the kind of whys and hows. So, on the other hand, if you were there with someone asking them questions, that Hawthorne effect problem, you may yourself bias their response. It matters who's asking the questions, right? People tend to, if they can identify with the person who's asking the questions, they'll often give more honest answers. And interviews, of course, take longer to carry out because you got to be face-to-face with people, taking that time. So you get a small sample size, and you have to be careful about that overgeneralization problem. If you took a sample of people to ask them about what their favorite French fries were, and you did it at McDonald's, you would probably get a pretty biased answer. You'd probably get a lot of people saying their favorite French fries were McDonald's. That can't be generalized to all people in the U.S. You couldn't say, well, the population of the United States prefers McDonald's French fries. No, that would be overgeneralizing. You can say people who eat at McDonald's prefer McDonald's French fries. Surveys can often give good correlational data. You can see what results tend to go together. So what correlates, such as women and kids distracting goes together more often than men and kids distracting. But it doesn't tell if one causes the other. Are women just naturally more distracted by kids, or maybe culturally, trained to be more distracted by kids, or do women have kids in the car more often, perhaps? I can say with certainty that everyone listening to this video is breathing, and everyone listening to this video will die. Those two facts correlate. 100% of people who breathe die. But that doesn't mean that breathing causes death. On the other hand, 100% of people who don't breathe die. If you stop breathing, you will die, and that will have been the cause of your death. So if you want to find out about cause and effect, a better way of doing it is an experiment. You create a controlled scenario where you can change just one variable, like whether or not there are kids in the car, and see what happens. Or take a bunch of male drivers and a bunch of female drivers and put kids in the car with them and see who ends up being more distracted by those kids being in the car. If women are more distracted with kids in the car than men with kids in the car, then maybe that tells you something about the way some women react to there being children. Of course, these kind of experiments are difficult to carry out for several reasons, including that putting a bunch of people in a car with random kids might be slightly dangerous. One of the most famous social science experiments was the Stanford prison experiment, in which they were curious about, why is it that we say power corrupts? Does getting into a position of power corrupt people, or are corruptible people more likely to push for those kind of positions? So if you want to find out if the position of power is causing problems, you set up an experiment. You take a bunch of college students and you randomly divide them into guards and prisoners. You don't let them pick which they want to be, because that would introduce another variable, the people who are picking those things. So you just assign them. Flip a coin, guard, prisoner. And what they saw was that many of the guards became cruel. About a third of them actually showed true sadistic qualities, taking pleasure in other people's pain. And several of the prisoners suffered emotional breakdowns, took the situation very seriously, even though they knew it was only a 2-week study and it was all just for pretend. But the different statuses seemed to cause different behavior. Now, there may have been some problems in the Stanford prison experiment. Hawthorne effect may have come into play. If you put a bunch of college students into a room and say, hey, we're going to watch you being guards, your job is to guard these people, they may act differently than they would if they were actually in a job of being a guard. Sample selection may have played a part as well. This was a bunch of young white male college students from Stanford University. Does that necessarily tell you how everyone in the United States or everyone in the world would react in in that situation? Don't overgeneralize. Lastly, the Stanford prison study involved some of the things the guards were doing were stripping the prisoners naked, making them act out scenarios, not quite sexual assault, but not far off, and doing things like making the guards clean out toilet bowls with their bare hands. And again, some of the guards had psychological breakdowns in the midst of this. So we have to follow a code of ethics in research. We have to protect our subjects from psychological and physical harm. We have to protect the confidentiality of our subjects, keep their identities secret. And this comes down to several things, but including in them is their safety after the study. If you were to say, survey someone about how they felt about their boss, and they said, oh, the terrible boss, and you publish John Brown says his boss is terrible and doesn't know what they're doing, that could lose him his job. You have to get their informed consent. People deserve respect, and we have to respect our subjects. We are using them for our own purposes, and they need to understand at least a basic level of what the study is going to be and what is expected of them, and say that they're okay with it. And then finally, we have to be ethical in our research conclusions as well, and in how we publish. We need to be honest and include all of the relevant data. We need to be objective and admit to any biases that we have going in. Also, funding sources. For instance, if you're doing a study on prisons and you're being funded by private prisons, that could be a conflict of interest. You need to say in your study, this is who we're being funded by, and this is how we are trying to avoid that biasing our results. So that is the basics of social science research. And from here, we have the groundwork from which we can study society scientifically.